I might have gotten distracted for a while. As a kid, I remember having a distinct fascination with Gary's Mod Prop Hunt, as I'm sure a lot of other people did as well considering the times. At that time, I didn't have a computer powerful enough to run the game, and, well, I had no friends. I don't remember what was so distinctly engaging about it. Maybe the mental trick of scanning around for tiny little outliers is just baked into the human consciousness. But there's a specific game that came out a while ago that really made me realize the overall potential that this idea has. What if the roles were reversed and Predator became Prey? No, we're not talking about that Prey. That game is sick as hell, but it's not today's subject, alright? It's a story-based AAA immersive sim. We have distinctly lower standards here on this channel. So what game am I talking about? You read the title. I don't even know why I'm here. So after taking an inexperienced and probably upsetting jab at Cruelty Squad, I felt like it was a nice opportunity to maybe take a few steps back and look at something more, I don't know, sane? But no, buckle up, because we're not just holding our heads underwater now, we're flat out fucking drowning. Golden Light is an FPS horror roguelike, I think. It takes place mostly within Satan's asshole, and never strays that far from the smells. The overall loop is something like this. Go into the gut, try to keep the shit in your ass while exploring, scavenging for items and gold, and find keys to open up the elevator down to the next floor. Rinse and repeat, go and find your girlfriend's body parts, put her back together like a demented Mrs. Potato Head. You return to this large open hub area either by dying or by recovering a body part. This downtime is very important actually. The Eternal Field is a mostly safe zone where you can explore and access different entry points into the dungeons. Exploring this area as much as you can as soon as you can is also very important. The same kind of important as missing out on a 25% defense boost item for almost 5 total hours of recording, because you thought this was a good career path instead of becoming a doctor or some shit. Outside of running around for items to pick up, there are a lot of important NPCs that provide services. Letting you buy weapons, perks also known as mementos, and just generally being kinda fucking weird, which is something I can get behind. Almost all of these inhuman NPCs are absolutely disgusting, to the level that only the most bloodborne-pilled degenerate monster fuckers would enjoy, but some of them are still somewhat reasonable. Gods, what the fuck is with me and birds? As I've cleverly alluded to with my big caffeine-soaked brain earlier, Golden Light very heavily pulls from games like Prop Hunt and Kingsfield. Levels are difficult to navigate even with the map, and they're often littered with traps. In terms of gameplay, it's a mostly standard slow-paced FPS with some non-traditional choices. For starters, you aim guns with the physical view model instead of a centered crosshair, denoted by the laser dot swinging around like my mental health. This is supplemented with an item system similar to pills in The Binding of Isaac, where you don't know their effect until you use them. However, instead of being forced to consume these items and contract some form of disease, you can throw them and splatter their juices all over the walls, releasing the locker room funk contained within. Speaking of these whack-ass items, everything is an absolute head mess. However, I feel like instead of being driven as the style of the game, everything is presented in a very literal manner and plainly represents what it's meant to be seen as. So while the general gameplay of running around dungeons and floors is just a cluster of random props that might try to show you how to do the British handshake, the game is never confusing in terms of readability. It's confusing in the terms of the amount of schlong all over the screen at almost all times. Now, let me get one thing straight. Not me. I'm probably the least traditional person you'll ever meet. Tradition took the kids and never wants to speak again. When games do weird, unconventional shit, it can be easy to compare it directly to its more common counterparts and take the contrast as a flaw. But that would also make you afraid of change, and I just want you to know that things do get better after high school, and sometimes you just have to take the plunge. This overall gameplay loop is astonishingly effective at both making you feel powerful and helpless. Aiming with the physical model of the weapon you're holding isn't necessarily an issue. I mean, in most shooters, you shoot out of your eyes. However, it creates these awkward situations where you need to shift your camera to the side and start strafing diagonally to make distance, which slows you down, but it adds an immense amount of tension to fighting. It's the same reason why tank controls work so well for Resident Evil games. And that's because this game doesn't want you to fight. You can fight, and you for sure can murder the fuck out of everything. But the inbuilt karma system flat out punishes you for succeeding in fights that you didn't even start. which makes me feel like even if I'm winning, I'm just gonna get hit with an assault charge the next day anyways. There's nothing necessarily wrong with there being a karma system. I actually think it's implemented quite well, as simple as it is, but it's pretty easily mitigated, and there are no permanent side effects, which means it ends up feeling more like something you need to babysit. So, looping back to that I think additive I clunkily maneuvered in earlier, what about Golden Light brings it being a roguelike into question? If you're so wet from the gutters that you don't know what a roguelike even is, please take a shower and get out of my house. But also let me explain. Roguelikes as a genre typically center around the idea that if you die, you have to start over with nothing. Most modern roguelikes play with the idea of permanent but minimal upgrades, and unlockables that present more possibilities and encounters in any given run, so that the more you play, the easier it becomes to progress, most of the time. Golden Light doesn't do any of this. The closest thing is being able to pick up Golden Mead to give yourself some extra max health, but right above that is being able to use an item that makes any memento stay after death as permanent upgrades. Normal roguelikes would depend on the idea that eventually Sisyphus would be strong enough to just Chris Redfield that shit. But Golden Light opts to do it all at double speed and provides complimentary Gatorade and Tartarus. But only the grape kind that makes you feel like you may be getting drugged. On top of this, items just spawn in at random whenever you're running around in the overworld. So, death is more of a long setback than any kind of actual loss. This makes progression feel a lot more like a more linear dungeon crawler experience that just folds back on itself every now and then, which isn't a bad thing. I just find it odd that this game is marketed as a roguelike when the rogue elements are pretty minimal, and the game actually, ends. Oh, and it has co-op. Oh wait, no, it'll probably kill you though, because it still does damage.
I had enough regen to get me to a specific point.
So if you're thinking, get to the point, how does this affect the game itself? Then shut up. Get out of my head, Mom. It's actually a pretty nice breath of fresh air. The indie market has a few roguelikes, so to have a game that basically takes the core idea of you go back to a hub area when you die, and then goes off in its own direction from there is engaging. It bridges the skill and sanity gap of traditional roguelikes between the I play on drizzle and I just got my 4th boss cell. So, all of this leading to a less overall punishing experience implies that the game has other things to show you, right? Golden Light's story is somewhat on the nose. Hell, most of it is told through short flashback sequences during level transitions. But that's not necessarily a downfall. I'll gladly take a story that's upfront and non-mysterious over one that doesn't even tell itself to you and probably doesn't actually exist. If the spoiler warning at the very beginning wasn't enough, here's another one. I will be discussing key story elements and throwing my thoughts into it, unfortunately. So if you want to do all that yourself, well, you probably paid attention to the first spoiler warning and you aren't even here right now, so I'm gonna guess that if you're still here, you should stop pretending to care. You play as an unnamed man, the supposed partner of She. From the moment that we enter the gut, it is immediately apparent that She and Rose are the only identifiably human NPCs in the entire game. Everything else is an absolute mishmash of random chunks of ground beef. Aside from Crown, my beloved, seriously, what the fuck is wrong with me? And if we exclude co-op portraying the player characters as another one of these masses of meat, likely for the sake of gameplay more than storytelling,
fucking die!
We don't know what the protagonist looks like, or if he's even human at all. Some NPCs refer to him as meat, but I mean, that wouldn't necessarily be wrong either way. We don't learn much about the main character, but from what little traits we're told about him, we can infer that he's a writer. He's an abjectly antisocial one, something I relate with very deeply, and he struggles with a number of nondescript mental issues, something I relate with very deeply. I'm not smart enough to do some fatty video level deep dive on this game's lore, but I'm stubborn enough to at least give it a go and inevitably be wrong. The entire reason that you find She split up into separate parts is because the main character, in some form, killed her. The gut is a representation of the main character's psyche and its cyclical events. If you kill every single boss in the game, representing hatred and vitriol for the gut, and by extension yourself, the ending you get is you, standing above the butchered and dismembered corpse of She, right back to where you started. This is why She needs to be put back together inside the gut in the first place. The protagonist couldn't move on. He relived his own mistakes, the very same things that probably shattered his relationship in the first place, and he couldn't forgive himself. All of the notes written in broken, crazed English that you find scattered around the gut are all from the player character, written on that very same typewriter that you see in the flashbacks. The protag has been through this before, many, many times, and depending on how you play, he will either eventually forgive himself and move on, or have a Sisyphean fistfight with his own brain as he drowns in purgatory just to wake right back up in the fields again. The only true way to break free of the cycle is to not kill anything. Go full pacifist. And sidestepping any inevitable poorly aged jokes, I'm going to instead explain why getting this ending is fucking annoying. See, if you're going for a pacifist run in a game that's specifically built for it, like the funny Tumblr game, it's simple. In Golden Light, it's nowhere near impossible, but seeing that the Wikispec's explanation of this is means of enemy death that don't involve direct attacks from the player don't seem to count against this condition, not only killed my confidence, but made me downright anxious to even just throw items to safely find out what their effects are without injecting my white-ass veins with ketchup. The wiki does state that kills from pets, damage over time effects from weapons, and thrown items don't count. But considering how long a playthrough can run for if you're just taking it casually, and how even just one direct kill, accidental or not, I didn't do this ending. I can't be fucked. So I just did postmortem research and called it a day. And if you're wondering where Rose fits into all this, what are you, a cop? I've never met a Rose in my life. There are 2 secret endings, bringing the total up to 5 between being a baby boy, a boy, a bad boy, a good boy, and a sad boy. I can't believe I scripted that. At the risk of hurting your precious feelings, I opted for the ending that facilitated a faster, easier playthrough so I could keep my thoughts fresh and do direct research into the rest of the game. Only to find out that it's the one ending I probably can't show on YouTube. Make no mistake, this doesn't mean that it affected my opinion of the game in any kind of negative way. I'm just an impatient headache in fishnets. Going over each of the 3 endings I haven't explained yet individually would be an abject waste of time, because one of them is horny would not only get me in trouble, it also just reiterates things that I've already mentioned. One of them is clearly a joke because you get it by breaking out of the map's boundaries in a way that immediately disqualifies you for the pacifist ending. And the super secret ending actually reveals a story segment so tremendous that I'm going to place a tertiary spoiler warning here, because to do otherwise would be YouTuber malpractice, and it's the one that I actually want to talk about. Throughout a playthrough, you'll eventually run into an NPC in the fields named Val. When you first meet Val, he's hunched over next to a piano. There's a dramatic wave of Mortal Kombat special effects showering over him, and a meat NPC up on top named Royal, who's essentially just holding Val there and forcing him to play the piano against his will. Kill him, and Val is freed. He becomes a merchant NPC at this point, selling golden keys for unlocking more portions of the fields. The next place you find Val is within the Endless Dungeon, which unlocks after you find all of She's body parts, where he says he'll show you something cool if you pay him at least 1,000 gold. The amount you have doesn't matter, accepting this option drops your gold count to 0 regardless. But immediately upon doing so, you're shown this. Val is the player character. After having his one light stolen away from him by Chad Thundercock, he further buried himself in his work in an attempt to think about anything else. It's implied through the writing of his final text that he became quite successful and took a piano, but with time, even that lost its luster. Money lost meaning, life lost meaning, and so Val took his own. The events of the game are quite literally his personal purgatory. And within the gut, even though they have been separated for years, she is still his golden light. Hell yes, I knew I could loop it back in the end. When I saw this, it shook me to my very bewitched icy core, because it was not only an effective way of adding further context to existing story beats without adding complicated new details, but it was also a very humanizing moment for the main character. The gut is his mind in its most raw, unfiltered, disgusting form, and it portrays him as this malformed, wasted away husk of a human being, with the head almost entirely twisted beyond recognition, symbolizing what led to the gut being created in the first place. Another niche detail that's probably just me overthinking things, each of the ending notes that you pick up to start the credits sequence, in stark contrast to every other note in the game, is written with perfectly sensible grammar. There's a medical term for when a patient is nearing death and they show a sudden improvement before passing, almost to the point of seeming like a full recovery. This is called terminal lucidity. It's mostly associated with dementia patients and how they suddenly become entirely lucid and stop having memory troubles just before they pass. And considering how a lot of the game plays on the idea of Val's recognition of real-world memories being twisted beyond recognition, I can't help but think of Everywhere at the End of Time, and then immediately get bitter again when I think about fandoms. Golden Light is a story of loss, mental health, and the struggle to pursue happiness in the face of life and the traumas it can bring. Now, above all else, I would classify myself more as an entertainer than anything. I'm not equipped to tackle these concepts at their roots, but if you believe you're struggling, I urge you to seek help. There is absolutely no shame in vulnerability, and maybe one day I'll take my own advice. Now, from all this, we can infer that the true pacifist ending is Val either being reincarnated as the child of She, which is weird, or he's finding one last moment of comfort and respite in the arms of the one person he cares about before letting himself finally slip away for good, leaving the gut and all of its inhabitants behind to rot. With all of the pieces laid in place, it's a pretty harsh comparison to the game I just played 10 minutes ago, where I was fisting wall glory holes and eating guns that set me on fire. So, do I like this game? Well, considering that it managed to peel back the layer of bitchy trans woman that says the funny fuck word purely with visual symbolism, it's pretty good. It made me stop telling jokes. What the hell do you want from me? It can be easy to point out that aside from roguelikes, the indie genre is also pretty saturated with games about mental health. Complaining about this basically just self-reports that you're neurotypical as hell, because telling these kinds of stories is, again, just a tale of humanity. Everyone faces issues, and for many of us, the best way to confront our problems is through creativity as a form of escapism. I am very mentally ill. While recording and writing, I found myself asking if I really had any issue with Golden Light, and outside of the restrictions for a pacifist run being much tighter than I think is necessary, seriously one accidental left click and that's it, I don't really have any major complaints or nitpicks to point out. From start to end, Golden Light is a confusing, occasionally frightening, wet mess of an experience. I was left feeling much more bewildered and in awe by the things I saw rather than feeling like the game was trying to make me think about things. But when I put the pretentious asshole hat on, it definitely made me appreciate a lot of the subtle and not so subtle tones that the game has. I think it's a great example of having you experience the story through action and interaction rather than just reading a text box or having a Bible driven through your skull. Man, people are really going to think I hate Cruelty Squad.